As I think of the headship veiling, why is that so important? Why do we discuss it? And there's, as we look at it in our churches, we're used to it, have more exposure to it. But in a Western civilization, we are one of the fewer, if you want to say, denominations or groups that would still practice it. Basically, the other denominations have thrown it out. They have essentially said it's not that important to them. Should it be important? Why is it important? And I look at it, number one, when we talk about the headship veiling, number one, it is the headship veiling. I do not believe the devotional covering and other terms like that is appropriate. It is a headship veiling. And why is it so important? Because this is at the bottom. This is at the foundation of our entire existence. Now dwell on that fact for a second. Get that in your head before we go on. The headship order, as is laid out in 1 Corinthians 11, and through it the symbol we have a headship veiling, that is at the very basis of the whole entire human race's very existence. It says there in 1 Corinthians 11, the head of every man is God. And that, folks, today, that is the total truth. Everything else in the entire Bible is based upon the fact that the head of every man is God. And take the thought of the veiling out for a moment. And with the veiling or no veiling, the point is the head of every man is God. And whether you have a veiling, you don't have a veiling, whatever you believe on it, someday you're going to stand before God and give an answer to God in your life for everything done in your life. That is the basics of the facts this morning. That is where the rest of what we talk about comes out of. If you do not believe that you're going to stand before God and that God is the head of every man and woman in the human race that ever has been, ever will be, then no, you won't understand the headship veiling. But the basic principle to remember, and we have driven this home time and time again, it seems like in the last year, and I'm not sure why God has led that way, but we have to get back something that is missing in Western civilization, especially American society. We have to get back to the fact you're going to have to answer before God. No matter how good you are at arguing the doctrines or why you do or don't do amongst yourselves or with your ministers or your family or whatever happens, some point you're going to have to answer before God, and God is truth. God is absolute truth. God has the whole truth. And when you stand before Him, what He says is truth is going to go no matter how good you can argue your position. No matter how good you think you've lived your life, you're going to have to answer to an almighty, omniscient God. And let that be the overriding factor as we look at this morning. A second thing by way of introduction, the veiling is a symbol. There is no special magic or salvation in the cloth itself. In the physical entity itself, there's nothing special. It is a symbol. There is no saving in a headship veiling just by putting it on. It is a symbol. And keep that in mind. But take a look in the Bible. Think for a second. And I'm not sure I fully understand this, but as you go through the Bible is full of symbols. God places an extremely high priority and emphasis and importance on symbols. We here, and imagine a lot of congregations with Easter coming up, are going to be partaking in another symbol shortly, and that is communion. The bread and the cup are two symbols that are in religious circles are fairly unanimously recognized and adhered to. But they are purely a symbol. Just like the headship veiling. It is a symbol. But God places an extreme importance on symbols. Why? I'm not sure I can say totally why, but there is something in the makeup of man, how God made man, where symbols are important. You talk to anybody, saved or unsaved. You hold up in this country, you hold up an American flag, and that can get people going. Especially in times of national crisis, whatever you think of the wars in the past, that flag is extremely important. You look at the monument to the Marines that raised the flag in the war against Japan in World War II. That flag raising was, has been put into people's memory for years and years. And they've made many monuments out of it. And people were dying just to get that flag up. Now, what was that flag? Was that flag a great weapon? No. That flag was just a symbol. There's something about mankind, the way God has made us, symbols are extremely important to anybody, saved or unsaved. But God, as you look in the Bible, God places an extreme importance upon symbols. Many, many, many things, Old Testament, New Testament, is based on a symbol. God has put it there for a reason. And I think back to Moses in the Old Testament. Do you remember when Moses was supposed to strike the rock? What did he do? He struck it twice. God, if you want to put it in human terms, was very upset with that. Why? The symbolism was he was supposed to strike it once because it symbolized Christ dying once and for all. Moses struck it twice. Was that just something God, punished him for a little and let it slide? What happened because Moses struck that rock twice? What happened? Who can tell me? He never entered the promised land. Simply striking a rock twice, Moses could not enter the promised land. You think the foot washing, we're going to be participating in that, another symbolism soon. Who can tell me, what did Christ say to Peter when he said he would refuse to take part in that symbolism? What did Christ say? Yeah, if you don't, I'll have no part with you. God is very serious about his symbols. So let's keep that in mind as we go forward this morning. The last thing, keep in mind, and Chad can attest, we covered this a lot with the young people down at Bible school. One thing we have to keep in mind, overriding as we sit here in the year 2001, is we are conditioned by our society. And in case you haven't realized it yet, I'm sure the older ones can attest it's more vivid to them than us younger ones, but society has drastically changed in the last 50, 60 years. So when you look at something, you're looking at something spiritual, something that God is saying, we need to go to the ultimate truth that never changes. Because if you look at things in light of what your society is doing, you will get a very warped opinion. And in this case, if we look at 1 Corinthians 11, we look at the headship veiling, the last 100 years has made a great change. You realize that out of all the history of mankind, it has only been within the last 100 years that by far and away the large majority of any kind of religious scholar would not support the headship veiling of any denomination. It's only been within the last 100 years. And it really started as a distinctly American thing. The Americans in 1895, they started doing ornamental hats. The Merry Widow was one that was first popularized. That was one of the great steps in religious circles for people moving away from the headship veiling. And it backs up with Tertullian. I'm going to reference Tertullian a couple times this morning. He was an early church father. He lived in AD 150, I believe it was, 160 to 250. Okay, so at 160, he was born less than 100 years after Corinthians was written. But this is what he says, and if you can't understand it, I'll explain it. And this is his quote. For these, for the most part, are the sources whence, from some ignorance or simplicity, custom finds its beginning, and then it is successfully confirmed by usage, and thus is maintained in opposition to the truth. That fits the headship veiling to a T. What he is saying is that there are things that for some convenience, a few people start doing, then as more and more people use it and do that thing, by the activity alone, it becomes the new custom. And that is what happened to the headship veiling in America. It became very convenient. Instead of doing a headship veiling, well, we'll still put something on our heads, but this is a little nicer, it looks a little nicer, it's a hat. And soon other people started doing them before long. By the early 1900s, that was the custom among women of the day, was to wear the hat. And now by the time you get to the generation we live in, aside from a few denominations, the world looks at it, they can't remember the headship family. It was the hat, wasn't it? But just like Tertullian said way back in the 1st century A.D., that was something that just by usage, out of convenience or ignorance, people just started doing something. Once enough people do it, then that becomes the new custom. But realize that's only within the last 100 years. It's also interesting as I studied this, I have here, and I'm not saying this is a good way to go, but this is the writing's all rubbed off the heel. I think it's a King James Study Bible. As I read the margin notes in this King James Study Bible, guess what? The margin notes in here support the headship veiling very clearly. Right down as we would. As I study some of my helps, and obviously it's going to be weeded out because I don't believe in having commentaries that are against my beliefs, other than very judiciously used for the sake of argument, maybe against. But the commentaries I all regularly use, as I pulled them down, you look at Thayer's, Joseph Thayer, the lexical expert. He has the Greek lexicon. Joseph Thayer, you read his stuff, what? All his writings would support the headship veiling. I looked at one of my other Bibles I used to carry, and has the commentary by Spiro Zodhiates, which he is fastly going the wrong way. But when that was written, guess what? He supported the headship veiling. I look at John Gill, the commentary I use quite a bit. John Gill, in his commentary on 1 Corinthians 11, guess what? He supports the headship veiling. It is only in the last 100 years in modern civilization, Western civilization, the people have begun practicing something different. And it's only within the last 100 years that religious people have started interpreting it against support for the headship veiling. So keep all those things in mind as we go forward this morning. But the most important fact is, let's go to the Bible and let's go down through and see what the Bible really says. Turn to 1 Corinthians chapter 11. 1 Corinthians chapter 11. Chad, could you get me something to drink? Water. 1 Corinthians chapter 11, verse 1. Be ye followers of me, even as I also am of Christ. And Paul is concluding here his prior dissertation in the chapters before that. As he teaches these things, he said, be ye followers of me. And that is literally a mime. The word followers there is the word we get our mime from. Copy me perfectly as I copy Christ perfectly. Verse 2. Now I praise you, brethren. Now I praise you, brethren. Who is this passage written to? What gender is this passage written to? Someone answer me. Men. We get things a little bit warped when we talk about the headship veiling a lot of times. A lot of it's focused on the women. It's slid off on the women. I'm saying to you men this morning, this is written to you. This is your problem. This is not the lady's problem. This is your problem. And Paul is very serious about this. But now I praise you, brethren, that ye remember me in all things, and keep the ordinances, traditions, as I delivered them to you. And that word that is in the King James here, it says ordinances. It can be translated traditions. The literal meaning behind that word is the things that I have passed on to you, referring to the doctrines when he was at the church, the things that he relayed to them as they ought to act. As he relayed those things on, he says he's giving them praise. He's encouraging them, thankful that as he has given them, that they keep those same things as I delivered them to you. And then verse 3, he goes on then to a new doctrine. Now remember this. He says in verse 2, as introduction, I praise you that as I have given these doctrines over to you, these ordinances and traditions over to you, as I have given them to you, you keep them. And then right now in verse 3, he goes on, but I would have you to know and understood another doctrine. So this isn't just, he's just not putting his wishes here. This is not something light. He's not giving them just some light food for thought. He is saying, as I have given you these other doctrines and ordinances, I'm saying unto you another one. Okay, so to Paul this is very important. But I would have you know that the head of every man is Christ, and the head of the woman is the man, and the head of Christ is God. God's headship order. This is God's fundamental order for the universe. God has set this order so that all things may function properly as He has ordained them. And for sake of time, I know I'm going to have to move this morning, and I hope this can be clear. It starts out by saying the head of every man is Christ. And notice it says every man. It's not just Christians. It's not just the church. It's every man. The head of every man is Christ. No one is without excuse. Christ is the head of all, saved and unsaved. And also then in this, the grammatical text here, in this every man is included women. It's not just the male gender. The head of everybody, male and female, is Christ. But specifically to the men. The head of all is Christ. The head of the woman is the man. And the head of Christ is God. While we are here on earth, it further relates then that the man is the head of the woman. Now, spiritually speaking, men and women are equal. As God ordained it from the past on through future into eternity, men and women are equal spiritually. Just for sake of reference, Genesis 1:27. So God created man in His own image, male and female created He them. Galatians 3:28. There is neither male nor female, for ye are all one in Christ. That is spiritually speaking. In God's order here on earth, there is a further order though. And that is, woman is subject to the man. Where did that start? All of you should know, what's the fellow you all went to see? Some of you went to see last weekend? Yeah, back to Genesis. Where was it all laid out? Back in Genesis. And we hear, and for sake of time, I'll just mention it. We won't turn to the passage. But we go back to Genesis. Woman was created out of man. Man was created first. Why was woman created? Woman was created to be a helpmeet for man. Now, let's get down to the basic. Sin. What started all this? Why do we have to have what we have today? Because of sin. Who sinned first? Eve. What was her sin? What was her sin? Okay, disobedience. And in particular, that disobedience referenced the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. How did Satan tempt her? What did Eve think she could do if she ate of that tree? Become like God. What does that do? If she wants to become like God, what is she doing? She's jumping out of her headship order, isn't she? She thinks, hey, it's God, Adam, and me. You know, if I eat of this tree, this person says, I can jump to the head of the order. So what was the first sin? Destroying the headship order, wanting to go out of God's order. That was the sin. And what did she do next? She complicated it even more. What was her next act? She went and tempted the person she was underneath, her head, her immediate head, Adam. She went and tempted him to do the same thing. Now, I don't know for sure. Not sure I grasp the whole picture of how it was with Adam and Eve in the garden. But if you look at the curses after the fall of man to the woman, it says, unto the woman he said, I will greatly multiply thy sorrow and thy conception. In sorrow thou shalt bring forth children. And by the way, he was talking about some of the wording and all. It's interesting to note, that sorrow meaning the birth pangs, you'll bring forth children. In the Hebrew, the word for pain in childbearing sounds like the Hebrew word tree. I guess it's a reminder, it was always a reminder to them that the childbearing pain was a direct result of Eve's sin in taking of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And then if you want to further follow God's symbolism, where was the ultimate redemption for that sin? Where was it finished at? The tree, the cross. I imagine God intentionally puts all those things in there, but it's interesting to follow them through. But then the last curse for woman says, and thy desire shall be to thy husband, and he shall rule over thee. The relationship between man and woman was different before sin. They were on much more of an equal term. Eve was supposed to go to advice to her husband Adam. And that was part of her sin there. She did not go through the headship that God had ordained. But The respect back and forth between man and woman was much more equal before the fall. Then let's go on. The head of the woman is the man, and the head of Christ is God. This last section, maybe we roll over a little too fast. And the head of Christ is God. Are God the Father and the Son, are they equal? Or is one head over the other? Somebody answer me. It says one and the same. What do you think? Yes, they are. The Trinity is equal. But what happened? When Christ came to earth to fulfill God, the Trinity's plan, did Christ have to do it? No. But what did he say in the garden? It seems to contradict that. What did he say in the garden? He prayed, said, "Not my will, but thine be done." And this is the beauty of this whole passage, which you have to grasp in God's headship order. It's not about inequality. It's about voluntary submission. And the head of Christ is God. Christ voluntarily, when he came to earth, put himself in subjection to God the Father. Voluntarily. Now think about that in the passage we're going to go on to. As we look at the headship veiling, the relationship between man and woman, that is the beauty of it. The great power on earth to a human came because what? Because Christ voluntarily subjected himself to God's will. And through that, we have the power. For you ladies, if you want to have the true power that God has in the beauty it is designed, you have to voluntarily subject yourself to your immediate head, which is the man. That is the importance of this passage. Because then through it all points to we are all subject to God. Christ is our head. Move on. Verse 4. Every man praying or prophesying, having his head covered, dishonoreth his head. Every man praying or prophesied, having his head covered, dishonoreth his head. And I could not believe at Bible school some of these young men that were wearing hats, and they had no idea that there was anything wrong. When I mentioned it, and I tried to be real nice about it, when I mentioned it, I got some really funny looks. And finally one of them said, what's the big deal? It's just as big a deal, if not worse, for a man to have his head covered as it is for a woman to have her head uncovered. And keep that, make sure you realize it. It's not just the women. It's the man thing. It's the men's responsibility here. And I'm going to show you why. And you pass this on to your children, and I hope, this should make an impression upon you. Why is this the case? Every man praying or prophesying, having his head covered, dishonoreth his own head. Turn to 2 Corinthians chapter 3. 2 Corinthians chapter 3, starting in verse 13. And not as Moses, which put a veil over his face, that the children of Israel could not steadfastly look to the end of that which is abolished, but their minds were blinded. For until this day remaineth the same veil untaken away in the reading of the Old Testament, which veil is done away in Christ. But even unto this day, when Moses is read, the veil is upon their heart. Remember, who is Paul speaking to here in Corinthians? What do you have here a lot? You have the Jews. What was the Jewish traditional practice for men in worship? Covered their head. Why? It was a sign in the Old Testament of their humiliation and their inadequacy. As they worshiped before God in the Old Testament, they had no way to get rid of that sin. They in no way were adequate to look at God. The veil was a sign, as they worshiped the men with their head covered, that was a sign of their inadequacy to God. A sign of their humiliation. What is different now? What does it say there in that verse? The veil is done away in Christ. Now Christ is saying, and through Paul here, what is being written is, we don't need that veil anymore, because what is the man's veil? The blood of Jesus Christ covers us. That is the man's veil. This is the symbolism that Christ is saying here, when he's specifically saying this is a command to the men, just as much as the other is a command to the ladies. Every man praying or prophesying, having his head covered, dishonoreth his head. Who is the man's head? What does it say in verse 3? It's Christ. If a man prays, worships, whatever, prophesies with his head covered, he is dishonoring Christ, and the word there is shame. He is shaming Christ. Why? Because he is effectively saying, if you pray with your head covered, if you worship, if you prophesy with your head covered, you are saying that Christ's death on the cross don't mean nothing to me. That is serious. And so you men, you boys, when you are in public, if you don't need that hat for protection, for other whatever, it needs to come off. The uncovered male head is a enduring sign for us of what Christ has done on the cross for us. Now, verse 5. But every woman that prayeth or prophesieth with her head uncovered dishonoreth her head. And I want you to get the picture here too. This is beautiful. Because this is what the world forgets. And I should go back. Wearing hats in the men. You know, the grunge look now. These boys, pull their cap way down on their head. And what is that usually a sign? You look at these boys and you can just tell. What is it? It's rebellion. They're doing that. It's the symbol of rebellion in our generation. But God said it way back then. He already knew it. That's a symbol of rebellion. When men cover their head, that is a sign that they are throwing away God's headship order. Now back here, back to the ladies. We have in the men, it is an enduring sign of what Christ has done for us on the cross. Love, forgiveness. And boy, don't the people in our society, we love to dwell on that, don't we? Denominations today, we want to dwell on that. But they forget, God is always balanced. And don't you forget it. And this is the other side. This is what the woman represents. And when we look at this, the headship veiling, you need to keep both in mind. Picture a husband and a wife standing by each other. On one side, you have the symbol of God's forgiveness, His death on the cross, His blood covering our sin. Then on the other side, what do we still have? What is the headship veiling? What is that a symbol of? God's headship order and God's authority. So you have, if you operate within God's authority, we can also partake of God's love and forgiveness. But the two cannot be separated. Where you have God's love and forgiveness, you also have God's ultimate authority. You can carry God's love and forgiveness only so far. At some point, you have to come to the realization that you have to do what God said. God's way is best. Without God's way, it'll be ruined. It is vanity. Vanity of vanity and vexation of spirit. Keep that in mind. When you see the ladies with their hell, on the other hand, it's balanced. It's supposed to be put together. But every woman that prayeth or prophesieth with her head uncovered dishonoreth her head. And who is her head? Her immediate head is the man. For that is even all one as if she were shaven. For if the woman be not covered, let her also be shorn. But if it be a shame for a woman to be shorn or shaven, let her be covered. Okay, take these two verses together. As we look at these two together, keep in mind now the day. He's writing to the Corinthians. In the Corinthian world, who went about shorn and shaven? The prostitutes. The adulteresses, that was their punishment, to have their head shaved. If you were caught in adultery, the woman had her head shaved. In other words, so if you wanted to be branded as an adulteress or a prostitute, you shaved your head. Okay? It's a shame. And he's saying here, but every woman that prayeth or prophesieth with her head uncovered dishonoreth, shameth her husband, her head. For that, okay, now the word that, and is very important when you're looking at the original, you look in Greek, their pronouns and antecedents were very strictly linked. Okay? And so you can really understand it a little better. For that, meaning praying or prophesying with your head uncovered. Okay, that is the antecedent for that. For that is even, or as if one and the same. One and the same as if she were shaven. So what is being said here is, if a woman prayeth or prophesieth with her head uncovered, that's the same as if she would shave her head and go around like a prostitute. Okay? Verse 6, for if the woman be not covered, let her also be shorn. So if she is not veiled, if she, in the sense here is the response of the woman herself. The woman is saying, no, I'm not going to veil myself. Paul says, if she rejects the veiling, if she's not going to wear the veiling, then go ahead and just cut all her hair off. It's the same thing. Okay? But if it be a shame for a woman to be shorn or shaven, so now he's taking it from the opposite viewpoint here. if you acknowledge that, yes, to be associated with the prostitutes and the adulteresses and all that, if that's a shame, then your ladies better be veiled. Your ladies better be veiled. And also keep in mind here, who's writing this? This is the Apostle Paul. Apostle Paul had a very good legal training. And whenever you read the Pauline epistles especially, he does not speak, his wording is very particular and for a reason. Think of a lawyer and is laying out bit by bit. You know, those lawyers, when they do the legal document, they'll go over and over and over that wording to make sure the wording is just so. And that's how Paul is. Paul does not put these words in here like this for no reason. He is extremely particular in his words. We're going to jump out of line here then. Oh my. And jump up to verse 15. Because one of the main questions with this then is the covering hair? Or is it a separate covering? Verse 15, but if a woman have long hair, it is a glory to her, for her hair is given her for a covering. Okay, number one, the word here, covering, in verse 15, is totally different from the word in any of the rest of the passage here in 1 Corinthians 11. In verse 5 and 6, when we're talking about covering, and also the anti-covering as it's referring to the man, that is the word, and you've heard this before, that is the word katakalupto. The Greek word, and it means something hanging down which completely covers. That is the literal meaning. It is something hanging down which completely covers. And also the verb form of that, the verb form of katakalupto is something put on. So therefore, if you have the verb, you take the verb and the noun together, it is something you put on that hangs down and completely covers. Now, I don't know how many of you ladies put on your hair every morning. But my guess is it's already there. Now, in verse 15, where it is talking about hair, it says, for a woman have long hair, it is a glory to her, for her hair is giving her for a covering. That, let me see if I can find here in my notes, that for, the literal translations for is to serve as. And so literally then that for a covering, because the word covering there then is parabulion, and that means something cast or thrown about. And the only other time it is used in the New Testament, it's talking about a cloak that is folded up. That's the only other time that parabulion is used in the New Testament. Okay? So it literally means cast or thrown about. It is a different word from what is used in verses 5 and 6. And so you put the two together, it is to serve as a natural covering. And the idea here, the hair for you ladies is a natural reminder of your position in relation to your husband. The hair for the ladies is a natural reminder of your position in relation to your husbands. The headship veiling, on the other hand, is something different that is referenced to God, the angels, and other people. So in other words, as you and your husband are at home, in your privacy, your hair, there's always a natural, God is saying that even take away the headship veiling, there is still nature. God has designed it so that nature, you have a natural covering showing your position to your husband, to the man. The headship veiling is a sign of the spiritual headship order. Now go back here, and let's just say, for sake of argument, that it was hair, that a headship veiling is hair. Let's read it. Verse 4, every man praying or prophesying, having his head covered, dishonoreth his head. So if he doesn't want to dishonor Christ, he'd have to take off his covering. That would mean that all of us, all the men, would have to be bald. If that covering, if katakalupto meant your hair, then men would have to be bald. Okay? Verse 5, but every woman that prayeth or prophesieth with her head uncovered. Okay, so you'd be saying here, every woman praying or prophesying, in verse 5, bald, dishonoreth her head, for that is the same as if she were bald. And that doesn't make sense. If she's already bald, how can that be? It's two different things. It can't be the same as if she were bald if she is bald. That is being bald. It's the same thing. In verse 6 further, for if the woman be not covered, so if you're trying to say that katakalupto is hair, you were saying, for if the woman is bald, let her also be made bald. Let her also be shorn. But if it be a shame for a woman to be bald, if it be shame for a woman to be cut her all her hair and be bald, let her also be covered. And so if you put the words in, like I said, Paul is a lawyer. And he knows the wording. So you put that together. You put it is a grammatical impossibility from verses 4, 5, and 6. It's a grammatical impossibility, according to the Scripture, for kataklupto to be hair. You put that on top of the fact, let's go one step further. Tertullian again. Tertullian wrote a treatise on the veiling. And it's interesting. He makes a quote. Let me see, I got it here. He states, "So did the Corinthians understand him," meaning Paul. "In fact, at this day, 100 years later, the Corinthians veil their women." So Tertullian is saying by personal experience, 100 years later, he's talking about the Corinthians. Paul is writing this to the Corinthians. Do you ever wonder how they interpreted it? And Tertullian here gives us proof. He says the Corinthians, to whom this is written, how did they think it was the hair, or did they think it was a covering? And you read Tertullian, he says the Corinthians understood Paul in this way as he is laying out with a headship veiling. He is saying the Corinthians, they still do it to this day, they veil their women. So the people to whom this book was written understood it, that the women should be veiled with a separate veiling. Okay? And then you put on top of that the third thing, which we mentioned at the beginning, and that is the cause and effect. What happens when women start doing away with the veiling? We've already said in our history, in our society, in our day and age, the loss of the headship veiling in American society has corresponded exactly with what? The breakdown of the family, the increase in the divorce rate, abortion, single motherhood. All that has corresponded directly with the disappearance of the headship veiling. And you can look at it today, and you all have experience. I'm sure you can look at churches. You look at churches that practice the headship veiling and have now gone against it. And look at that church and see where they end up. And that is the thing that really, it pains me as I look here at our congregation and I look at our future. That's one thing nobody will ever be able to convince me. And I've had people now, personally, I'm not that old, but I have had church people and ministers from other congregations that have decided to start letting down their standards, smaller coverings, doilies, or virtually now nothing. And at the time, you would say, if you balk everything else, you say, okay, they're being sincere, we'll just see what happens. That's the scary part. I look now, 5 years later, 10 years later, we can see what happened. And they lost everything. And that's why it gets back to my point. This is the foundation. The headship order of God is the foundation for our very existence as the human race. You start toying with that, and everything else goes too. Keep that in mind. Again, I'm a historian. I like proof. You look at the catacombs in Rome, the early church. The pictures in the catacombs at Rome. What's interesting about it? The ladies, they're veiled. And you can go on and on and on. But you take Paul, the legal person. We have the document as is laid out. You parse it grammatically, it cannot be anything but a veiling, a separate veiling. We have the witnesses of how it was interpreted, the people it was written to. Tertullian gives us, and others, Jerome does also. The Corinthians took it as a separate veiling. We look at the cause and effect, what has happened since then. You take all those things together for a legal person, he goes to court, what do you have? In our judicial system, they call it an airtight case. And you put all these things together, and it's pretty simple. The other question I'd like to address real quickly, some then would say, hey, it's just for church. Praying or prophesying, they get that together with worship. What does it say for the ladies? 1 Corinthians 14, and I'll just read it. 34. Let your women keep silence in the church, for it is not permitted unto them to speak, but they are commanded to be under obedience, as also saith the law. And if they will learn anything, let them ask their husbands at home, for it is a shame for women to speak in the church. The women aren't supposed to be praying and prophesying in public in the church. So that means they are praying and prophesying somewhere else. And notice also, there's nothing wrong with a woman praying and prophesying. And that prophesying is giving out God's word. But it's not publicly in the church. So that throws out that argument right there, because Paul is saying they're supposed to be covered when they pray and prophesy. They don't prophesy in the church, so there evidently must be other places. The other point is the prostitutes. They covered their heads so you don't get branded with shame like the prostitutes. What, do you do that only in church? What about when you go out in public? Do you want to look like a prostitute then too? No, it should be any time. You want to be associated with the adulteresses and the prostitutes. And then it goes on. Should you just pray and prophesy at a given time? Just in church? No. You should be ready at any time. You should, as the Bible says, you should be in a constant attitude of prayer. And that is why we believe in a application that is for all, that is continuous. And also then, if you look at the wording in verse 6, it says then, let her be covered. That is present, active, imperative tense. Let her be covered. Present, active, imperative. It's a command. It's to be done now. And it's an active thing that continues into the future. The one last thing that we didn't mention yet, and just to wrap this up, if you all can bear with me, and this is just for your thought, maybe for your interest, you can study out yourself. The phrase, verse 11, verse 10, for this cause ought the woman to have power on her head because of the angels. The word power there means symbol of authority. For this cause, the woman ought to have a symbol of authority on her head because of the angels. We are here today in the presence of angels. Now there's some different ideas what these angels can be. They're good, they're bad. The good angels, you think of Passover. Angels, remember, are not omniscient. At the time of Passover, and there's the death angel was going to go across, they had to perform a symbol to mark that they were God's people. Remember, the blood on the doorpost. For you ladies, and this I'm talking specifically to you ladies, there is a literal power in your headship veiling, because that is a symbol to the angels that are present in your life that you are at one with God's headship order, that you are one of God's people. You take off that symbol, they don't know. Angels are not omniscient. And so as they go through the world looking, by your headship veiling, they can tell whether, at least on the outside. And remember, we're not saying just because you wear a headship veiling doesn't mean that you are right with God. But keep in mind then, the other angels are looking also. And this is, I'm going to read the scripture. You can draw your own conclusion, but I want to be clear. I'm not saying this is the gospel truth, but I want you to look at this. Turn to 2 Peter chapter 2. Put your finger in 2 Peter chapter 2 and turn over to Jude first. The book of Jude. Book of Jude, verse 6 and 7. And the angels which kept not their first estate, but left their own habitation, he hath reserved in everlasting chains unto darkness, unto the judgment of the great day, even as Sodom and Gomorrah and the cities about them in like manner, giving themselves over to fornication and going after strange flesh, are set forth an example of suffering the vengeance of eternal fire. The angels, the fallen angels that went with Satan, it says here about them, okay, God has them reserved for judgment, even as Sodom and Gomorrah. What was the angels? What did they do? What was bad? Even as Sodom and Gomorrah committed fornication, went after strange flesh. These angels, somehow, they went after strange flesh. Turn back to that 2 Peter chapter 2, verse 4. For if God spared not the angels that sinned, but cast them down to hell, and delivered them into chains of darkness to be reserved unto judgment, and spared not the old world. Now turn to Genesis chapter 6. Genesis chapter 6. And it came to pass, when men began to multiply on the face of the earth, and daughters were born unto them, that the sons of God saw the daughters of men, that they were fair, and they took them wives of all which they chose. Who were those sons of God? In this passage in Genesis 6, there's two feelings. They could be the descendants of Seth. But the word translated sons of God here is translated angels in other parts of the Bible. If these were the sons of God, if these were the fallen angels, what did they do? They had relations with the daughters of men, which is strange flesh. Just like they did that in Jude there in 1 Peter. Why did we have a flood? And again, I'm throwing this is my thinking, and there's some other people's thinking, not just mine. But I'm not saying this is gospel. Why did we have a flood? You think about this. Genesis chapter 6, these sons of God came and had children with the daughters of men. A few verses after this is when God declared the flood. Angels are immortal. Angels are also non-redeemable. What if they have children with the daughters of men? It could be there was a group of a race being propagated on the earth that was evil and non-redeemable and immortal. So God wiped them out. That's for your thinking. You can study that out. I appreciate your attention. I'm sorry I went a little overtime. But Paul ends this up in verse, is it 15 or 16 there? Paul ends it up and he says, if there are any among you that are contentious, and then again, your pronoun in antecedent, it goes back to verse 13. Back to verse 13 where it says, judge yourselves. Is it comely for a woman to pray uncovered? The antecedent goes back to that and it says, if there's any of you that are contentious, if there's any of you that disagree with this, Paul says, we have no reference. None of the other apostles and no churches that he knows of would hold that a woman can pray and prophesy uncovered. If you have any other questions, I hope this sparks your interest. You can study yourself. Be glad to talk with you afterwards if you have questions. But the thing to remember about all this, and especially to you ladies, there's angels all around. The Jewish tradition was that the bad angels, the evil spirits, loved to see a woman unveiled. They lusted after her. Where the good angels would stay as far away from her as possible so they would not be tempted. Do you want the good angels close to you or far away from you? But most importantly for you men, this is your problem. Your wife being unveiled is a shame to you. This is your problem. You better deal with it. And for the men, it's just as important that we be uncovered. Our uncovered head is an eternal sign of God's death, Christ's death, and His blood covering us. You women being veiled is an eternal sign of God's headship order and God's ultimate authority. Let's kneel for prayer.